G'day YouTube, warbles on a lot here. This 3/8 size chain on my 038 Magnum Stihl has done 40 minutes cutting air-dried stringy bark, this bit of which probably died and regrew in the 1930s and then died again in the 1950s, and it's basically been drying out ever since. This stuff, closer to the ground in the same tree, as well as a much younger stringy bark, which has only been air drying for probably 5 years and still had its bark. I trust you can see the line of bluntness across the front of each cutter tooth. Now, for the sake of those who've never used a chainsaw, let alone tried to sharpen one, this tooth and this tooth and all the teeth on this side, they cut half the top of the cut, or the bottom of the cut, and half the side on this edge. Whereas this tooth, and this tooth and all the teeth on this side, they cut half of the top and all of the side on this side. And you wind up with a scurf that gets turned into sawdust. And of course, there's an overlap between this and this and this and this and this. So you get a continuous cut. As long as all the teeth are the same profile, as long as all the teeth are equally sharp, and as long as all of these, which are called either the rakers or the chippers, because they rake the chip of sawdust out of the way. Sawdust produced by this cutter is raked out of the way by that chipper or raker. They're also called the depth gauges, because the distance from here, the cutting edge, to here, the top of the raker, that determines how deep each cutter goes into the wood. Which you may think is a esoteric thing to worry about until you see this. And you realise that pretty much the only thing that holds the chain in alignment is the equality of the depth of the cut on either side of the scurf. If you've got teeth on one side of the chain that are larger than the teeth on the other side, or that are blunter, or whose depth gauges have them cutting deeper, then the whole chain will get pushed over to one side, and instead of cutting a straight line through your timber, you will run off to one side, and then your straight bar will become stuck when it can't follow the radius that the teeth are cutting. So there's always been a bit of a palaver when it comes to sharpening the chainsaw, because as you can imagine, it is absolutely critical not only to have the exact correct size file, but you've also got to have the angle of the dangle and the rake exactly correct for the chain that you're trying to sharpen. So, assuming that we're back in the 1950s, what one would do is go through the chain link by link, looking for the particular tooth that has the least amount of damage to it, the greatest amount of damage, and then using one's round file, trying very tongue-in teeth to maintain a constant angle of the dangle and a constant pressure on each stroke, one counts the number of strokes necessary to repair the cutting edge on the worst damaged tooth. Then one goes around and applies exactly the same number of strokes, always pushing, removing the file, and then pushing again, never ever ever dragging the file backwards. At the same pressure, one applies the same number of strokes to every tooth on the chain. Ideally, you've now got a sharp chain with identical sized teeth, identical shaped teeth, identically raked teeth. And after that, one would take pretty much any flat-edged file and do the same with the rakers or the depth gauges, because the depth of those rakers is what determines how far the cutters are permitted to sink into the timber. One of the first aids that I ever saw was this, which came with a Dolmar 110 that my father got in about 1973 or 74. It gives you two little windows, and the theory is that it helps you hold the file at the correct attitude and angle by placing the file guide over the top of the file, then holding the file back against the tooth and observing the orientation through the little window in the horizontal surface. And of course, one did all the teeth on one side of the chain from one side before walking around to do all the teeth on the other side of the chain. And then by laying the file guide over the top of the chain, you can just barely see where you're supposed to rest and file the depth gauge or raker. So, such is your 1970s technology for sharpening the chainsaw. And then in the 1980s, small, cheap 12-volt grindstones became available. And the theory was that one simply eyeballed it and moved backwards and forwards like this. And part of the problem was that with use, the grindstone rapidly lost material and became smaller. And once the grindstone becomes smaller, whereas once upon a time, the grindstone was exactly the same size as the file and it perfectly fit the front of the cutter, what goes on with the ever decreasing grindstone diameter is that you lose control of the actual profile because you're wobbling the thing up and down and backwards and forwards while you're moving it in and out, which you're supposed to do. And essentially you randomize the profile on all your cutters. And then, just to make it even worse, you'll use this thing on the rakers. And that all goes random as well. So pretty much any handheld grindstone like that, not good. If you go to a chainsaw shop to get your chain professionally sharpened, you'll find that they use probably 3 times this diameter a grinding wheel with a specially profiled thick semicircular edge. These are not by any means the correct wheels. I'm just using them to demonstrate the principle. And they will rotate the grinding wheel in that direction, and it will be mechanically oriented so that it goes straight in, it profiles the tooth, it removes exactly the right amount of material. And these days, because China manufactures consumer grade power tools to the world, you can buy a desktop or benchtop version for the private individual. Trouble is, there are so many critical angles and dangles and joints to get everything exactly right. it's difficult to do for a price that a amateur consumer is likely to want to pay. So from the 1990s and the early 2000s on, I have been using this sort of a strap-on file guide. Suitably equipped with its aiming and alignment marks, by which one is able to stay aligned while filing each tooth. And maybe every second, third, fourth or fifth time one sharpened the teeth, giving exactly the same number of strokes at exactly the same pressure, at exactly the correct angle of the dangle, sweep and rake to every tooth on the chain, maybe every third or fifth time, when it seemed that the saw was starting to polish its way through the wood as the teeth became ever smaller and the depth of cut grew smaller and smaller, then one would move in with a file and have a go at reducing the height of the depth gauge. And that's what gave me pretty much the best results overall, and I've been using the chainsaw now since 1984. And recently, several months ago, one of the American YouTube channels that I'm subscribed to, namely Project Farm, introduced me to the concept of this, which is a Stihl 2-in-1, being a handle which has 3 files, 4 depth gauges. 2 of the files are round for cutting for sharpening the cutting teeth, and the central file is rectangular, flat-faced. And it's obviously not actually new, because in 28 languages, just below German, it says 2-in-1 file holder, resharpens cutter and lowers depth gauge in a single operation. And the instructions literally assume that you can't read, because the whole thing is a single 14-step cartoon. And the reason we know it can't possibly be new is because it says it's Andrea Stihl AG and Company KG 2014, copyright. So these have been around for 7 years at least before I ever heard of them. That gives you an idea of the depth of the social black hole at the bottom of which I dwell, where time moves more slowly and new ideas take longer to filter in. And thank you to Project Farm for raising the scales from mine eyes and showing me a better way to sharpen my saw. Sadly though, my vise is too small, lacks the depth for me to be able to follow the instructions to the letter, so therefore I've had to come up with my own warble modification, which involves loosely tucking the back of the hand grip into the vise, merely to locate it, then using a simple expedient of an old leather glove against the nose of the bar, while holding the bar against my belly, wedged against the vise, thus enabling me to have both hands free with which to use the file. Having first applied the chain brake as per the cartoon instructions. As you can see, the file holder has an arrow showing the direction in which one is expected to apply the cutting stroke. And if you try to do it upside down, it's not going to work, but you can notice that, assuming you pay attention. When applied properly, The round chainsaw file contacts the tooth. The square or rectangular depth gauge file contacts the depth gauge. And the depth of cut of the depth gauge file is set by these square-edged rails which rest on the cutter teeth. And to get your rake angle straight, you've got this as a gauge. You've got little thin inscribed lines on the rakers, and you've got this plastic edge as a gauge. So it's kind of difficult to get out of whack that way. You've got all kinds of visual indications if you're off that way. And I find it's not actually too hard. To do a single pass, transforming blunt teeth into sharp teeth. Then release the chain brake. Take your next marked tooth back to where it can be filed and go again. Sorry about the zoom. See if you can see a bit more this time. They do suggest using a felt-tipped pen to put a bit of ink on one of the teeth to tell you when you've been around the chain once already. But because where the chain is joined, you quite often get two teeth consecutively on the same side. That's pretty easy to figure out where to start and where to stop. And if you're in any doubt when filing on one side, you can always check to see the sort of reflective finish on the top of the filed depth gauge versus the dirty burnt resin effect from the sawdust on top of the unfiled depth gauge. So, don't know whether that's just a pro tip, but I find these two teeth on the same side tells me where to stop and where to start. Okay, so there are the teeth either side of the joining link, both cutting on the same side of the chain. Having used the 2-in-1 file on that side, push that away. We now turn it over and bingo, we can come up pushing on the other side. Once again, use this to line up, stay lined up with these marks here, stay lined up with these marks here, and finish up lined up there. And this hand does the pushing, this hand sort of does the controlling, and you have to push down pretty hard, I find, to make sure the depth gauge is being contacted. And yes, all the depth gauges have got shiny little tops on them. So that's working. This one has no shiny top on it. Oh, what a simple system. I wonder why it took so long before somebody figured that one out. Okay. Right, there's the two. It may not be jet engine maintenance, but a badly sharpened chainsaw chain can kill you just as dead as a messed up jet wheel. There you go. How's that for a sharp looking saw chain? So, wonders will never cease. Thanks again to Project Farm for putting me on the track of that little innovative bit of technology. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Lunchtime. Ciao.